In this lecture, I'm going to try and complicate how we understand Frederick Wertham, similar to what I tried to do with Wonder Woman, and also go into a little bit more detail about the after effects, the significance of the comics code being established. Now, first of all, one thing I want to stress is that Wertham was not the first person to raise questions about comics. Right? There were questions, as we talked about before, during World War II. And you can see this here. This is a very interesting, this is from during the war, the case against the comics. I believe this was published in 1944. And in it, you can kind of see the devil using these terrible images to try and influence the minds of these children. And this was actually put out by a Catholic organization. And you have Father Thomas Doyle in the Catholic World writing, in a vulgar way, Superman seems to personify the primitive religion expounded by Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Man alone is and must be our God, says Zarathustra, very much in the style of a Nazi pamphleteer. Like it or not, there are plenty of American children who know more about the man wonder Superman than they do about Christ or any of the great characters of the Bible. And religious groups were not the only groups who kind of questioned comics and criticized them. There were other groups as well. But I think that in many ways, comics seemed like a definite challenge to religious groups because, as you can see here, they're kind of seen as a competition, right? Can Jesus, as described in the Bible, can he compete in terms of excitement with Superman, right? Which is more interesting if you're a little kid, right? And I'm not trying to criticize religion, certainly not. My point here, rather, is that comics were an effective competitor for religion, right? You want to read the Bible, or do you want to read Superman? Even if you're a religious person, it might be hard, right, to pick one. But you can also see, again, there's this fear. It's not just competition, and I think there's something to this, that the values expressed in comics are not do not match religious values. Superman is sometimes compared to someone like Moses. That makes sense in various ways. But think about Superman compared to Jesus, right? It's a very different kind of figure. And a lot of the comics emphasize strength and power, but traditional Christian theology emphasizes things like humility. You don't beat up your enemies, you're supposed to forgive them. Or if you do have to fight them, you don't mock them when you do so, as Batman and Superman did in their origin stories. So we have to stress here that this was something that was felt broadly by many people, that comics were a threat, both in terms of being a competition, but also in terms of their worldview. And church groups, scouting groups, and other organizations at times would actually get together and get children. Sometimes they would pay children, they would give them other books, or they would just require it as part of a class, but get children to collect comics, and then the comics would be destroyed. And some of the kids agreed with this. Others, looking back on it, said, we really shouldn't have done this. But the key thing that disturbed many people was, we're kind of like, is this what the Nazis were doing? Like destroying, burning books? I mean, they're comic books, but, from many Americans, this was something that was very uncomfortable. Remember, there's this tension between freedom and trying to discipline and order society to make sure that the democracy survives. So we want to stress, it's not just Frederick Wertham. There's other people who are saying these kinds of things, and of course more people will come out and support him. And so I want to stress, it's not like this guy's some lone nut. He's not. He really hits a chord with many people in the United States who are afraid, who are fearful for the children, who are fearful of the communists, and just aren't sure what to do. Now, I'm trying to complicate him, and so far, I haven't made him really look good. And I'm going to talk about some things now that are really cringy, right? So just be warned, this stuff's really cringy. I don't even want to talk about this or look at it, but it is important in terms of understanding what's going on. So please just bear with me. So in one of the documentary clips that you were to watch in preparation for this section, they mentioned, one of the people mentioned that, Werthams said basically that Batman and Robin were gay, and was very critical of this. And it's interesting because usually when I hear this, people just kind of laugh and say, yeah, that's absurd, right? And the implication is that they're not gay. And that's why this is absurd or something like that. I'm not sure. They don't really take this issue seriously because it does seem so absurd and very cringy. To make things even more cringy, I'm going to read to you some of what Wertham wrote about Batman and Robin. So like I say, this is cringy, but I do have a point, so please bear with me. So in his book, Seduction of the Innocent, he wrote, several years ago, a California psychiatrist pointed out that the Batman stories are psychologically homosexual. Our researches confirm this entirely. Only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and of the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize a subtle atmosphere of homoeroticism which pervades the adventures of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin. At home, they lead an idyllic life. They are Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. Bruce Wayne is described as a socialite, and the official relationship is that Dick is Bruce's ward. They live in sumptuous quarters with beautiful flowers and large vases. That's an odd detail. And have a butler, Alfred. Batman is sometimes shown in a dressing gown. As they sit by the fireplace, the young boy sometimes worries about his partner. Something's wrong with Bruce. He hasn't been himself these past few days. It is like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Now, while we're being cringy, let's just knock out what he said about Wonder Woman. For boys, Wonder Woman is a frightening image. For girls, she is a morbid ideal. Where Batman is anti-feminine, the attractive Wonder Woman and her counterparts are definitely anti-masculine. Okay, so in a sense, part of this is to give a more balanced view of Wertham. So you may say, why are you talking about these things? This is really terrible. This is really cringy. So what's going on here? And I basically have 3 points I'm trying to make. First, as a historian, when we see something this cringy, we have to kind of say, okay, what was the cause of this? What's going on here? Right? This was mainstream, right? This isn't someone off on the margins who we can just dismiss. This was a major figure in psychiatry at the time. He wrote a book that was very influential. He testified, we'll talk about this later, at Brown versus Board of Education, arguing for desegregation of schools. I'll talk more about that later. So Wertham is a heavyweight, right? He's not a lightweight. This is a guy who people take seriously, and he's writing something like that. So we have to ask ourselves, what was going on in the United States that this would not only be acceptable, but people would be like, yeah, that's a problem, right? And again, I don't want to be too cringy, but I think it's fascinating, this part about the beautiful flowers. And it's this connection of being unmanly to being gay, right? If you were a gay man, that kind of meant you weren't a real man, right? You couldn't be masculine. And if you're not being masculine, how are you going to defeat the communists, right? And if we don't have strong fatherly men to keep order, what's going to happen to our society? Right? So I know it's difficult when you see something that's this cringy to make sense of it, but we can kind of start making sense of it that way. And I bring this up because when you write your papers, you don't have to do something like this. I'm not saying you should do something that, really, like I said, I'm very uncomfortable just reading that. You don't have to do something that you find uncomfortable like that. But if you're like, I want to understand why there was this kind of for homophobia during this time period. I want to understand why it was there. It makes sense to kind of try and analyze it. That means trying to detach ourselves and trying to understand, okay, what's going on here? So that's kind of my first point that I wanted to make. The second point was, again, we have to consider how the readers can see things that maybe the authors didn't necessarily intend, and we can't always know what the authors intended. So usually and I've watched a lot of different people talk about this, and usually they're kind of like, well, of course, this is absurd. Batman and Robin clearly are not gay, and so this is crazy. Wertham's a nut. And you may think he's a nut. But this kind of misses the point that authors' intentions aren't the only thing. What's important is also how people receive and understand the comic. And what's interesting is, in his book, Seduction of the Innocent, Wertham talks to a gay man about how he liked Batman and Robin and how they played a role in his fantasy life. So you can imagine this. Imagine that you are a boy in the 40s and into the 50s, and you've hit puberty, and your friends are getting interested in girls, but you're not. You find yourself feeling something different. You find yourself being attractive to boys, and you're in this culture that, you don't do that. And that's not going to be easy for you. And you can see how in many ways, yeah, this would be a great fantasy. These male authority figures who are seen as up, are raised up, they're taking care of Robin, and Robin gets to have all these cool adventures, and, they get to have this very close relationship. Of course, if you are a young gay man or a young boy, in this time period, of course, this could be very attractive, right? And that's something we have to kind of think about when we think about the readers of comics and other things like that. Who are they? And they may read things into something or fantasize about something that might not be the author's intent, but it's not unreasonable for them to find that there, right? Okay. So at this point, you're just like, I like Wertham even less, you're probably thinking. So now I had to go into that detail. Now I'm going to try and balance things a bit. So like I say, Wertham's a complex guy. So let's look at a couple images. First of all, one thing I want to point out that he was concerned about was that crime comic books actually explained how to have alibis, how to break into buildings, how to commit crimes. So he's not completely irrational. And one thing I really have to stress, when he talks about this bit about Wonder Woman, he only deals with her for a page, I think. And Batman and Robin only get a few pages. And it's fascinating to me that everyone zeroes in on that. Right? People zero in on that. Because it is cringy. And it lets us, it kind of, it's, it's very negative. And it lets us kind of just pile on Wertham. But the thing was, he does have a point here, I think, about what these comics could teach people. And then this is the color image. This is the actual comic. But in his books, and this is a page from Seduction of the Innocent, in his book, The Seduction of the Innocent, he has this image, and it's from an actual comic book. And you can again see maybe this is a little, disturbing. And, but you may look at this and say, well, Wertham's a prude. Right? He's a prude. He's just made uncomfortable by having an attractive, scantily clad woman. He's just a prude. And it's actually much more complex than that. I'll talk more about this momentarily, but Wertham was very concerned about young people's body images. He was concerned that comics were making young people feel bad about their bodies. You're a young girl and you look at this and you're like, there is no way I can compete with Phantom Lady. And so one thing that's interesting, like I said, he doesn't spend that much time with Batman and Robin or Superman. What he does spend a lot of time, and he has a whole chapter on it, is the use of advertising in comics. And he has a whole chapter. And this is a quote. Some adolescents, depending on their type of constitution, pass through phases of growth when they're apt to be chubby. So some kids go through a phase when they're a little big. Is that something unimportant, which most of them will outgrow? And if you went to your physician, they'd probably say, yeah, maybe want to not have so many snacks, but it's not a big deal. No, comic book ads say, there are valuable secrets on how to get the most out of your life. Discover how to be loved. Do something positive about your unsightly superfluous fat. Buy these tablets for $1.98. So what Wertham is criticizing, and I think this is where we can kind of see this guy is complex. He is really disturbed about how comic books, through both their images of these kind of perfect people, how through these images, these perfect people were making kids feel bad about themselves and then trying to get them to pay money to engage in medical treatment or buy medicines or other things that probably weren't going to help them, that might harm them and would certainly take their money. And you can see this idea. You want to be loved, you need to be thin. You need to be thin to be loved, right? And he's fighting against that. He says, this is wrong. And he does the same thing for boys, too. It's not just girls. There are other secrets, too, to help the adolescent girl once she becomes sufficiently self-conscious about her figure. Belts, girdles, creams, pills, tablets, books, reducing contraptions. So he's very concerned about this idea that comics are making young people feel bad about their bodies and then doing that to get money from them. Now, I'm not sure if there's a conscious conspiracy to do that, but certainly the effect is there. And so he's arguing, trying to protect young people from this kind of thing. You may disagree with the guy. Like I say, says some things that are really cringy. But I think his heart's really in the right place in this chapter. Now let's continue on. So I had this image of Phantom Lady that he finds disturbing. And it's not just about being a prude. This is an image of bondage. And he's afraid that that comics will make this connection, especially among boys, between eroticism and violence against women, right? You're attracted to this woman, right? She's really pretty, isn't she? And look, she's tied up. Or look, she's being spanked, right? Or look, she's being slapped. And so he's really concerned because you would have boys being titillated, being sexually aroused by these images of attractive women, but then they're women suffering violence. And he's really concerned that that's going to make men develop in a sexually in a way that is going to cause them to be violent against women. And of course, that means they can't be good, strong fathers. And so again, he's trying to protect people. He's trying to prevent violence. Just to give you another example, and I apologize, the next couple images are going to be really disturbing, but to be fair to Wertham, we have to look at these and we have to note this cringy stuff he's writing about Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman. He spends more times on things like this, right? In this comic, they don't come out and show it directly, but there's a description of a rape and then the woman is murdered. Please bear with me. The next image is really disturbing. If you skip forward a minute, you'll miss it, but I'm going to talk about it. So I'll just give you a second if you want to skip forward. Okay, here we go. This is an image from Wertham's book, Seduction of the Innocent. At the bottom, he writes, "Children told me what the man was going to do with the red hot poker." This is the original image. You can tell by the body language what the implication is. Even if they don't show it, the horror is still there. You still have this idea of sexual violence against women, which he is very much against. And this was the kind of thing that could appear in a comic book that a kid could get a hold of. I don't need to go into more detail. Very disturbing. To further complicate matters, Wertham was really bothered that African American people did not have easy access to psychiatry. He believed that, like many psychologists did and still do, that we can really improve society and help people live better and happier lives by giving them psychological treatment. And especially if we can get to young children who are troubled, it's a lot easier to help them deal with their problems then. And he was very hopeful about the possibility of psychology and very disturbed that African Americans did not have access to it, typically because of issues of wealth. But of course, this is still the days of segregation. That also made it difficult. So beneath St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem, and this is a church where people like W.E.B. Du Bois went to church at times, he will help establish, and I can't pronounce it, I apologize, the Lafargue Clinic. And the clinic treated African-American patients, had African-American staff, that patients were treated at low or no cost. Right? So he's out there trying to help African-Americans and who are being underserved. I should also point out the clinic, Lafargue, I apologize, I'm butchering his name, was a Cuban who was a Marxist, right? Marx is the founder of communism. So he was on the political left. And so it's easy to think of these guys saying, oh, censorship, they're on the political right. No, they're not. Wertham in many ways is on the political left. right? They named the comic after a Marxist, someone who's on the far left. So this is, we want to stress this. This guy, like I said, is complex. And one reason he goes after comics is he sees them particularly as preying on minority people. And I'll come back to this, especially African Americans. We'll come back to this. And I alluded to this earlier, and there's Wertham playing with and observing some African American children as part of the clinic, part of his research. He was called to give expert testimony at Brown versus Board of Education. If you're not familiar with that case, that's the case that made that's the case that made segregated schools illegal. Right? You had this idea of separate but equal, right? We'll have separate schools for African Americans, separate schools for white kids, but they weren't equal, right? The white schools always got more money and were better schools. So African American children were getting a poor education. Of course, that made it difficult for them to improve their situation. And it was basically meant to keep African Americans in a marginalized position. He testified that this caused major psychological damage to African American children, and was therefore part of getting that segregation overturned in the United States. So like I said, this is a complex person, right? There's a lot of problems with the science he used. He in many ways was irrational and illogical. He said things that are extraordinarily cringy, that are just offensive today. But this guy's complex, right? He's complex. And to continue, we'll deal more with this with the issue of race. He didn't talk about it very much, but he was also disturbed by how people of color, particularly African Americans, and I say it says corpses of colored people. We have to remember in this time period, colored people was acceptable way to refer to people. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, for example. Today we say people of color. It's just from his time period. This was meant to be respectful, and he's disturbed. And when we think about the history of lynching in the United States, we can understand that in those jungle comics, oftentimes you had powerful white people beating up on people who were black, people who were clearly African. And he was disturbed by that, and he criticized it. Not as much in his book, but he does sneak it in there. And I wish we could identify what the comic this came from. I don't think it's been identified. Not everything he refers to has been identified, but he says, these I can keep. And that in itself is very disturbing. So that was the first thing I wanted to do. I want to kind of stress how Wertham is a complex person. Now to kind of continue, we need to talk about the after effects of the comics code, right? There is the Charles Murphy, Judge Murphy, who was in charge of the censorship. This is the kind of thing he was having done, right? They make this woman go from being ugly to being not so ugly. And this is one of the things about censorship. Sometimes it just seems kind of silly. I don't know if this makes children any safer, but it does limit artistic creativity. And especially if you do something like horror, it's important that things look scary. And this really destroys that. Now, the comics code is complex, but I do want to quote two parts of the comics code. One is that crime should never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with the desire to imitate criminals. Like, I can kind of get the last one, but, I mean, if we're not sympathetic for criminals, that means that we can't accept any idea that there might be social factors behind why they did the things they did, right? The criminal's supposed to be unsympathetic, so it's not that the criminal suffered from poverty or racism, it's that the criminal is bad. And he's just bad, right? You cannot promote distrust of the force of law and justice. Again, I can kind of understand that, but there are corrupt police officers, there's corrupt judges. You know, you can't tell a story, right? Think of some of the great works of novels and things like that. You can't put them here, right? Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. You can see that fear about wanting to maintain authority, wanting to discipline society. But again, I can kind of understand this, but this really limits what you can do. How can you engage in social criticism, of social critique, if you can't criticize respected institutions? right? How can you do that? It's impossible. So what happens is we get this. This is actually a Japanese comic, but I mean, wow. Exciting stuff. Haha, he hit the ball really hard. And so comics become something for kids, right? This limits the ability of comics to develop with the audience as it matures. There will be some recovery eventually, but won't be enough to make it comics seriously competitive with other forms of entertainment. Television's getting big. And what's going to happen is television will essentially replace comics in the United States. Now, comics will, to a certain degree, come back. Like I said, I'm old enough. I remember being able to buy comics in the 80s in a drugstore, but it's not like that anymore. But in Japan, it is. Because in Japan, what happened was comics could continue to develop as the audience matured, because even though there was kind of a comic scare during this time period, it never got traction. And to show you what that means, if you look at statistics on manga, I mean, these are old statistics, but about 1/4 in terms of worth of all books that were sold were manga in Japan. In terms of volume, so, basically for every 2 books that were sold, 1 comic was sold in Japan. That's astounding, right? And if you look at this, in 2017, the top-selling Japanese comic in 1 year sold 11 million copies, and then you've got a bunch who are 6 and 5 million. Number 10 is about 2,700,000. In the United States, a comic that's like a top seller maybe sells 100,000 a month, so you're looking at about 1.2 million. We have something like about, I think, 2.5, 3 times the population of Japan, yet our comics are selling like 1/3 less than them. Right? And I want to stress, that's an exceptional American comic. So you can really see how in many ways this really took a developing industry and really made it so that it couldn't continue to develop. It couldn't become something that would be for mature people. And when it finally could, when it got that freedom, it had always been relegated to kids stuff or to a subculture. It's not mainstream. In Japan, it was able to become mainstream. And that's a serious divergence in our story.